For years, rumours persisted that amongst the collection of the University of Strasbourg were body parts from Jewish victims of the Nazis, some still in jars labelled Jew.
Not even in the most twisted fantasies of Dr. Frankenstein were the levels of sadism and dehumanization reached as in the experiments conducted in Nazi concentration camps. Jewish and Romani prisoners were systematically subjected to a battery of medical and genetic tests and trials, whose sole purpose was to use them as test animals to pursue a superior race. In today's video, we will focus on the most atrocious experiments and who the perverse ideologists behind these practices, now considered crimes against humanity, were. If you are sensitive, we recommend caution on this journey to the Nazi past in a new installment of Military History. The victims of these Nazi experiments were mostly Jews from all over Europe, although also Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and disabled Germans. These groups were forced to participate without any kind of consent. Generally, the experiments resulted in the death, disfigurement, or permanent disability of the patients, which is why they are seen as examples of medical torture. These atrocities were carried out in the various concentration camps that the Third Reich had throughout the Second World War. One of the main testing sites was Auschwitz and Ravensbrück. There and in other camps, inmates were selected to be subjects of study for sinister experiments aimed at aiding German military personnel in combat, the recovery of wounded military personnel, and the promotion of the racial ideology of the Third Reich. Other tests included attempts to cure homosexuality, for example. The Nazis were in a positivist and scientific development and had millions of people they considered inferior to freely experiment with their bodies, violating medical ethics without scruples. The SS doctors assigned to concentration camps played a special role as they were responsible for overseeing the activities of the intern doctors who had been forced to work in the camp's medical service. Many of these doctors were Jews and were forced to intervene brutally and savagely on patients of their own background. Just to give an example, between 1942 and 1943, various tests were carried out in the Ravensbrück concentration camp to study bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration. One of these activities involved bone transplantation, which was carried out in inhuman ways to observe the patient's reactions. Sections of bones, muscles, and nerves were extracted without anesthesia, resulting in many victims experiencing intense agony, mutilation, or permanent disability. Let's examine a testimony of a mild yet terrible case during the Nuremberg trial. The audio of the original material is slightly damaged, but it is understood that the woman on the stand cannot move one of her feet and that a large portion of muscle from her calf was removed, mutilating her forever.
Like this. Up. Now try to do it here. Yes. Dorsiflexion is completely gone.
One of the first atrocities carried out by the Nazis in the camps had a corporate tint. Between 1941 and 1944, SS camp doctors Friedrich Entress, Helmuth Feder, and Eduard Wirtz conducted clinical trials on the tolerance and effectiveness of new drugs and medications. Such risky tests are usually performed under the strictest care and precautions. However, during the height of the Third Reich, e.g. Farbenindustrie, the pharmaceutical conglomerate of the Führer, particularly Bayer, used human guinea pigs to test their products. These trial medications were administered to prisoners suffering from contagious diseases, many of whom had been deliberately infected by SS doctors to test vaccines. But the Nazis weren't solely driven by corporate interests. In 1942, Professor August Hirt, head of the anatomy department at the Reich University in Strasbourg, set out to assemble a collection of Jewish skeletons under the auspices of the Ahnenerbe Foundation. It's as sinister as it sounds. The Nazi madness aimed to understand anthropologically those they considered inferior beings. Hirt received permission from Himmler to select a necessary and varied number of prisoners in the Auschwitz concentration camp. According to official records, the selection of 115 individuals comprised 79 Jewish men, 30 Jewish women, 2 Poles, and 4 Asians, probably Soviet prisoners of war. The preliminary preparation involved biometric measurements and the collection of personal data so that each skeleton would have a clinical history. Once the data collection was completed, the chosen ones were mercilessly sent to the extermination sites where they were killed in the gas chamber. The victims' corpses were sent to Hurt as material for his skeleton collection, intended for use in anthropological studies demonstrating the superiority of the Nordic race. There, they would be embalmed and analyzed, as recorded by the Nazi scientist himself in one of his reports. They were given a false physical examination to reassure them, and then they were gassed. The corpses were immediately transported to the anatomy pavilion of the University Hospital of Strasbourg. A French embalmer, who had to assist the project director, recounted how preservation began immediately, with the arrival of bodies still warm, with very open and bright eyes. Due to the Nazis' defeat, Hurt's sinister work remained unfinished, and like all Nazis with their atrocities, this doctor attempted to erase the traces of his research to avoid being judged. He discarded many of the skeletons and dissected bodies, but mainly cut and burned their heads to prevent any possibility of identification. While some tried to empirically prove the existence of the Aryan race, others tried to expand it directly, convinced of its supremacy. Karl Klauberg experimented with sterilization systems on the female population of the Auschwitz camp. This depraved Nazi scientist developed a method of non-surgical mass sterilization involving the introduction of a specially prepared chemical irritant into the female reproductive organs to produce severe inflammation. Thousands of Jewish and Romani women were subjected to this treatment, involving multiple local injections, causing them terrible pains, inflamed ovaries, stomach spasms, and bleeding. The interventions severely damaged the victim's ovaries, which were then removed and sent to Berlin for examination. After several weeks, the fallopian tubes would close and block due to inflammation. Klauberg's experiments killed some of his patients, and others were executed to allow for autopsies.
These young people served the fascist doctors as research material in causing sterility. This young woman was subjected to injections of poisonous substances.
Let's remember that the idea behind making inferior women infertile was to populate the world with the Aryan race and to ensure the extinction of Jews and Roma. Another professional who followed this line was Dr. Horst Schumann. Like his colleague, Schumann sought a practical means of mass sterilization that would allow the Third Reich to carry out the biological destruction of conquered nations through scientific methods by depriving people of their reproductive capacity. In one of the barracks at Birkenau, a sterilization by X-rays apparatus was installed for this doctor. Daily, several dozen Jewish prisoners, both men and women, were subjected to sterilization experiments involving exposing women's ovaries and men's testicles to X-rays. Various intensities of rays were applied at different intervals, seeking the precise dose of the procedure to achieve infertility. Radiation exposure caused severe burns on the subject's abdomen, groin, and buttocks, resulting in suppurating sores that became infected and ultimately killed them. The results of the X-ray sterilization experiments were not satisfactory. In an article he sent to Himmler in April 1944, Schumann expressed his preference for surgical castration as it was faster and safer. These experiments make it clear that Jews and Roma were treated as mere test animals, nothing more, nothing less. However, the Nazis' ambitions would grow darker when they began to fantasize about genetic studies of prisoners. Not only were millions of people systematically murdered in concentration camps, but they were also subjected to ruthless research regarding genes and human capabilities. For example, Dr. Johann Paul Kremer conducted an experiment in Auschwitz on the changes that occur in the human body as a result of extreme hunger, particularly liver atrophy. Many of them were on the verge of exhaustion, in the final stages of starvation unto death while being studied. When they reached that state, most of them were ordered to be killed by phenol injection. However, there was a practice carried out by Kremer himself that was truly gruesome. He selected prisoners whom he found particularly interesting as experimental material, and just before their death, while lying on the autopsy table awaiting the injection, He questioned them about personal data such as their weight before arrest and the medications they had used, lifestyle habits, among others. Kramer said he was interested in the changes that occur in the human body as a result of hunger, in an attempt to find some kind of medication to alleviate that suffering in German men. Now let's see how during the Nuremberg trials, Nazi doctors were accused of conducting wild tests to see how the human body behaved in a fall from an airplane.
The report describes the victim's reactions: spasmodic convulsions, agonal convulsive breathing, chronic convulsions and groaning. He yells loud, convulses arms and legs, grimaces, bites his tongue, does not respond to speech, gives the impression of someone who is completely out of his mind. The evidence which we will produce will establish that the defendants Rupp and Romberg personally participated with Rascher in experiments resulting in death and torture.
Among other genetic studies to achieve Aryan race superiority, and above all to cure and heal wounded Nazi soldiers during the Second World War, Dr. Karl Gebhardt, Himmler's personal physician, would commit true atrocities. Along with his assistants, Fritz Fischer and Ludwig Stumpfegger, they began to conduct experiments on young and healthy prisoners of questionable scientific validity. Their tasks resembled more of a slaughterhouse than a medical office, as they amputated limbs of camp inhabitants wholesale and then tested various orthopedic prostheses. These monstrosities occurred mainly in Ravensbrück, where Gebhardt conducted sinister medical experiments involving amputations, defenestrations, exchange of amputated limbs, re-implants of arms or legs between prisoners, dissections of living and unanesthetized people, and experiments with antibiotics. Believing that he justified his actions by stating that he was carrying out these trials to save German soldiers, he simulated war wounds in prisoners, whether by introducing splinters of wood, metal shards, dirt, glass, or foreign bodies infected with various streptococci to provoke gas gangrene and tetanus. The idea was to injure Jews and Roma for further study. The experiments were followed by the observation of control subjects, that is, without treatment, to assess the effects of the experience. Most prisoners died due to infections and trial conditions, while others who showed some improvement were gassed once they were finished being examined. While everything we've just heard is as terrible as it is unbelievable, there is one name that has gone down in history as the most twisted of all. We are talking about Josef Mengele, who was considered a genius by the Nazis, extremely respected in academic circles, and a fundamental part of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology, Genetics, and Eugenics. He was basically drawn to any genetic malformation or anomaly in humans, as he aimed to prevent errors in the Aryan race and try to foster what he considered genetically beneficial traits. Mengele's first experimental subjects were Romani children, those suffering from noma, a gangrenous bacterial disease of the mouth and face characteristic of the Romani ethnicity, were executed by the Nazis' orders to conduct pathological research on their corpses. Sinisterly, he commanded to preserve their small organs and even the complete heads of the children, which were sent in jars to institutions like the Academy of Medicine in Graz, Austria, for analysis. The scientist also began selecting dwarfs and individuals with physical peculiarities, including congenital disabilities and developmental defects that occur in dwarfism, from transports carrying Jews to the camps. Mengele's research subjects were better fed and housed than other prisoners, temporarily safe from execution in the gas chambers. When visiting his young subjects, he presented himself as Uncle Mengele and offered them sweets, making the relationship even more twisted. In 1941, Mengele led a series of experiments to try to discover how to treat hypothermia. One study forced subjects to endure in a tank of icy water for at least 3 hours. In another case, he placed naked prisoners outdoors in sub-zero temperatures for several hours. In addition to studying their physical effects, the experimenters tried to devise different ways to rewarm the survivors once they had undergone the trauma. Here we see the results on the bodies of some Jewish children.
Children had frost-bitten feet. The Germans had been leaving them for 12 hours in the frost.
The method of experimentation was torturous. Selections focused on young and healthy Jews who were stripped and prepared for the trial. An isolated probe measuring the drop in body temperature was inserted into the rectum and held in place by an expandable metal ring that was adjusted to open inside the rectum and hold it firmly in place. The victim was dressed in a German Air Force uniform and then placed in the cold water tub to begin the freezing process. The studies revealed that most lost consciousness halfway through the process and died when their body temperature dropped to 25 degrees C. The bodies were studied and discarded, and then another test subject was used. Mengele took advantage of Auschwitz as an opportunity to continue his anthropological studies and research on heredity, his great fascination. As noted, his medical procedures showed no consideration for the health, safety, or physical and emotional suffering of the victims. He was particularly obsessed with identical twins, people with heterochromia iridum, the characteristic of having eyes of two different colors, as well as people with physical anomalies and dwarfism. Mengele's less invasive experiments included attempts to change the iris color by injecting chemicals into the eyes of living subjects, even attempting eye transplants. When that failed, he killed people with heterochromatic eyes so he could remove them and send them to Berlin for study. His experiments with dwarfs and deformed people included taking physical measurements and extracting blood, teeth, and skin. He also treated them with trial medications and unnecessary X-rays. Many of his victims were sent to the gas chambers after a few weeks of experimentation, but their skeletons were recovered and sent to the German capital for further analysis. Mengele also sought out pregnant women with whom he conducted experiments before sending them to the gas chambers. One survivor claims to have witnessed how the sinister Nazi doctor performed anesthesia-free vivisection, extracting hearts and stomachs from the victims to see and understand the behavior of the organs and the dying patients. Patients who survived these savage interventions were forced back into forced labor until their demise. In the first phase of his experiments with his fetish element, Mengele subjected pairs of twins and people with physical disabilities to special medical examinations. Generally painful and exhausting, these examinations lasted for hours and were a difficult experience for patients, as most were hungry and terrified children, because Mengele's twisted mind preferred to experiment on young subjects to understand their development. Subjects were photographed, plaster molds of their teeth and jaws were made, and their fingerprints and footprints were taken. As soon as the examinations ended, Mengele ordered twins, dwarfs, and deformities to be killed by a phenol injection so he could move on to the next phase of his experiments, the comparative analysis of internal organs during autopsy. From 1944 onwards, twins were selected and placed in special barracks. Auschwitz provided Mengele with a large number of specimens to study. Some of those selected, like Irene and René Gutmann, were already in the camp. Let's listen to their testimony.
When I got to the infirmary, what I remember is I always had to get undressed and being put between two cold plates, which I know were called Röntgen machines. I think that's X-ray. And measured and weighed and poked and pushed.
I remember going to Mengele specifically, have recollections of blood being taken from my neck and my arms. I hate doctors.
Mengele's twin research aimed in part to demonstrate the supremacy of heredity over the environment, and thus strengthen the Nazi premise of the genetic superiority of the Aryan race. According to the Nazi, twins provided the perfect experimental specimens, as one could serve as a control while the other endured the experiments. Studies on twins were also motivated by the intention of increasing the reproduction rate of the German race by improving the chances of racially desirable people having twins. Already in an unsustainable spiral of madness, a witness described how Mengele sewed two Romani twins back-to-back in a savage attempt to create Siamese twins, causing both children to die of gangrene after several days of suffering. Given the criminality of all cases, these actions were judged in what became known as the doctor's trial. Rejection of the abuses perpetrated led to the development of the Nuremberg Code on medical ethics. Of the over 3,000 children involved in Mengelé's experiments, barely around 200 survived. They now reside around the world, and those still alive seek information about what was done to them. Their files have never been located, and the experiments they were subjected to remain a mystery. These barbaric atrocities are just another example of what Nazism was capable of in its attempt to confirm and perpetrate the dominance of the Aryan race on the planet.
이러한 것도 진짜의 직근이 시오시대 태도가 아시 하오가 이러한 같은 것때 하다데 류치노나가니入ってるのを見ました.
What you just heard is a Japanese doctor confessing to having participated in abominable human experiments. And be careful, because this is just the tip of the iceberg, as it wasn't only the Japanese who resorted to these practices. Vivisections, people forcibly sewn together and men locked in pressurized chambers that made their heads explode. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you everything about the cruelest scientists of World War II. So let's start with the forced experiments of the Nazis. This was one of the most atrocious violations of human rights that occurred in the Third Reich. The obsession of National Socialism with blood purity led to thousands of people being classified as impure, meaning a threat to the Aryan race. It was believed that if they were allowed to reproduce freely, they would eventually lead Germany to ruin and decadence. None of this could be allowed, so all those considered genetically inferior were transferred to concentration camps. There, as they were seen as subhuman, they were subjected to terrible medical experiments. Not even minors were spared from such hell. Although there are no definitive figures to determine the number of victims, it is estimated that among them were about 2,000 children born between 1930 and 1944. The most unfortunate ended up in Auschwitz, where the infamous Dr. Josef Mengele awaited them, one of the most reputable scientists of the Third Reich. The Angel of Death, as he was nicknamed, used the extermination center as his personal playground. He was convinced that through his research he could decipher the formula to create the purest and most perfect humans in the world. He was drawn to genetic deformities or anything that deviated from the norm. Hunchbacks, people with dwarfism, and those with different colored eyes were among his favorites. However, his true obsession, what kept him awake at night, were identical twins. During his time in Auschwitz, Mengele conducted experiments on about 700 twins, most of whom were minors. The torture began when the doctor ordered them to be confined to barracks separated from the rest of the prisoners. They were given more and better food than others, so their health would be optimal, but even so they probably sensed that they were about to undergo hell. Indeed, after a few weeks, they were taken to the laboratory of the Angel of Death. They were tied hand and foot so they wouldn't protest when injections containing viruses or bacteria were administered. They were always infected with different variants of the same virus, so the reaction of each could be observed. At times, Mengele's sadism reached unheard-of levels. Children underwent unnecessary amputations of arms or legs, or blood transfusions were performed from one twin to the other. One of his goals was to find out if it was possible to turn a boy into a girl through blood experiments, but this never succeeded. On the other hand, he tried to create artificial Siamese twins. For this, he sewed two children back to back and tried to unify their organs. The young ones cried for days until the inevitable happened. Like almost all of Mengele's guinea pigs, their wounds became infected, and shortly thereafter they died of gangrene. This was not at all unusual, and when it happened, the doctor ordered the corpses to be dissected for study. When one twin died and the other survived, the latter was killed to remove his organs and compare them with those of the deceased twin. Let's hear the testimony of Ava Moses Kaur, a victim of the angel of death who managed to survive.
Take a lot of blood from my left arm and give me a minimum of 5 injections into my right arm. The content of those injections we didn't know then, and unfortunately I still do not know today.
All of this may seem like madness worthy of the best horror movie, but things do not end here. Mengele carried out dozens of experiments, including an attempt to change a person's eye color. One of the best documented cases is that of Vera and Olga Kriegel, 2 twins who were 5 years old when they arrived at Auschwitz in 1943. The girls were locked in a small cell where they had barely enough space to move and were forcibly injected daily. Although they did not initially know what it was, over time they learned that the true reason behind the injections was to alter the color of their eyes. The only one who survived the torture was Vera Kriegel, who endured the pain of losing her sister in traumatic conditions. In the decades after World War II, she rebuilt her life but continued to narrate her experience so that the events of Auschwitz would not be forgotten. The cruelty of the Nazi scientists knew no bounds, but the truth is that they were not the only ones committing such crimes. Human experiments were also carried out by the United States, one of the countries at war with Germany, that nevertheless resorted to similar practices. The American military used soldiers of Puerto Rican, African, and Japanese descent to test drugs and biological weapons. Although racism in this country did not reach the extremes of Germany, many considered whites as superior humans. It was a more subtle and less violent form of discrimination than that of the Third Reich, but remember that in the United States, African Americans did not have political rights until well into the 20th century. In the American Armed Forces, non-white troops were considered incapable of performing certain tasks and holding positions that required a lot of responsibility. For this reason, they were assigned simple missions, such as cooking, logistical support, hauling, or driving vehicles. However, some of them were recruited for a secret program whose goal was to test the effects of mustard gas on men. The idea behind the experiments was to confirm how harmful this chemical agent was and how it could be improved to make it more effective on the battlefield. Those who volunteered for the tests were aware of the danger they faced. Unlike the Nazi Empire, in this case they were not prisoners forced to act against their will. However, many of them did not know how far the suffering would go, or could only imagine the physical consequences that would last for the rest of their lives. They were experimented on in different ways. Sometimes patches containing liquid mustard gas were applied to their skin. On other occasions, simulated battlefields were organized where soldiers maneuvered as if they were in the middle of a military operation. In this way, when they least expected it, mustard gas was thrown at them to see its effects on men who were outdoors and adrenaline-fueled by combat. The most dangerous tests were those where subjects were locked in a chamber, inside which the poison was released. The experimentation program was classified, so it did not appear in official government records, nor was what happened in the testing recorded in the military files of the participants. While scientists controlled the immediate effects of mustard gas, in the long term they did not receive medical attention, and the profound consequences of the poison were ignored. On the other hand, the contract they signed stated that they could not disclose information about the experiments. Otherwise, they could be discharged from the army and even go to prison on charges of divulging state secrets. Mustard gas damages a person's DNA as soon as it comes into contact with the skin. The first thing it does is burn the skin, leaving highly painful burns and blisters. Victims describe it as an intense fire that penetrates to the bones and makes them scream in despair. Let's hear from a veteran who was used in one of these experiments to recount what he saw.
Some guys had bad reactions, big blisters, nasty looking things, and some like me didn't have much reaction at all. So, but this was the Army's way of studying the effects of mustard gas.
In the long term, mustard gas can cause diseases such as leukemia, asthma, skin cancer, or emphysema. However, none of this could be properly treated due to the oath of silence that the soldiers had taken. The experimentation program ran during World War II, but also in the decades that followed. It was definitively discontinued in 1993, but it is estimated that over all that time, about 60,000 people were used as guinea pigs. Now that we are aware of what happened in Germany and the United States, let's see what Japan did. The crimes of Josef Mengele are well known today, but few know that the Japanese reached levels of cruelty as high or even worse than those of the Nazis. The Japanese Empire created Unit 731, a military research group tasked with organizing human experiments and developing biological weapons. It was active between the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II, from 1937 to 1945. The government allocated almost unlimited resources for state-of-the-art technology and established 27 laboratories. The scientists assigned to Unit 731 were professional doctors who were fanatical supporters of the emperor. They had no qualms about torturing people to improve Japanese weaponry. The majority of the prisoners forced to participate in the experiments were Chinese. To the Japanese, they were considered inferior beings, and killing them was no worse than crushing an insect. The specialty of this group was vivisection, meaning dissecting a living person to study their internal organs. Thousands of men, women, and children were subjected to this atrocity, often without anesthesia, causing indescribable pain. This procedure was carried out after injecting victims with viruses or bacteria. When the disease took effect, prisoners were removed from their cells and taken to the vivisection room. They were stripped naked and placed on a table where they were tied down. To prevent them from screaming, a towel was placed in their mouths. Simultaneously, a scalpel cut their torso, exposing all their internal organs. This allowed scientists to study the consequences of the inoculated disease on each organ. Let's hear a member of Unit 731 describe it in his own words.
В каких экспериментах над людьми вы принимали участие?
8年の不正だと記憶しています。ワクチンの効力検定をやるために中国人、それから満人を約50名余り人体実験に使用しました。砂糖水を作って、砂糖水の中にジブス菌を入れて、そしてそれを強制的に飲ませて細菌に感染をさせて、そしてその人体実験によって亡くなった人は12、3名だと記憶しています。
Unit 731 also amputated limbs to study the effects of massive blood loss. It was common for the limbs to be reattached to the body, but on the opposite side. For example, a left arm would be placed where the right arm should have been. It's difficult to discern the logic behind certain practices, which seem to have been driven more by malevolence than the pursuit of medical innovations. Some doctors, for instance, removed patients' stomachs and then connected the esophagus to the intestines. Others extracted pieces of lungs, brain, or liver, observing how many days the patient could survive in this condition. Sometimes victims were sealed in a pressurized chamber where the atmosphere was so dense that their eyes popped out of their sockets. As we'll hear in the next interrogation of a Unit 731 member, neither women nor children were spared from cruelty.
Были ли среди подопытных заключенных женщины?
おりました。
Были.
おそらくロシア人だと思います。
Одна из этих женщин была с грудным ребенком?
持っておりました。
После того, когда человек подвергался заражению соответствующими бактериями, его лечили в тюрьме отряда или нет? А после того, когда он выздоравливал, что с ним происходило?
相当長い期間を置きました後に、また他の実験に供されるのが常であります。
И так делалось до смерти человека?
そういうことになります。
Да, так делалось. Следовательно, за все время существования тюрьмы, время известное вам, ни один из заключенных живым оттуда не вышел.
その通りであります。
Именно так.
Not only were chemical or biological weapons tested, but human guinea pigs were also used to assess the effectiveness of traditional firearms. Prisoners were tied to posts and used as targets to test flamethrowers, grenades, rifles, and pistols. Few survived the shooting practices and other experiments, but those who did were usually executed with lethal injections and then dissected to seize their most valuable organs. As the Second World War approached its end, Unit 731 members did everything possible to cover their tracks. They destroyed evidence and killed the prisoners still alive. If there were no witnesses, they believed they could never be judged for their crimes. When American forces occupied Japan, they agreed with unit members on diplomatic immunity in exchange for sharing the results of their research. The only ones who judged Japanese sadism were the Soviets, who, in 1949, organized the Khabarovsk trials. In this process, several high-ranking officials of the Imperial Japanese Army and some leaders of Unit 731 were sentenced to prison. In conclusion, as you can see, the Nazis were not the only ones conducting brutal experiments. Currently, it is known that such practices were common in various countries, regardless of the side they were on in the war.
That there were different experiments. Not all the experiments were the same. But we were used in experiments 6 days a week.
Some of the most horrendous practices that occurred in concentration camps during Nazism were carried out in the name of science. As unbelievable as it may sound, Third Reich doctors tortured and mercilessly used the bodies of inmates, displaying absolute cruelty. All of this was done in an attempt to find answers to the ailments suffered by German soldiers. In their logic, prisoners deserved to die for being scum and to allow for sanitary developments for the Aryan race. In today's video, we are going to explore some of the most sinister names in the Nazi scientific roster and what twisted experiments they conducted in the Dachau concentration camp. Get ready for a journey back in time, directly to the Nazi operating table, guided by military history. Among the darkest shadows of the Holocaust, the twisted ethics of the Nazi Party opened the door to medical experiments that defied sanity and the bounds of humanity. When the attention of German scientists shifted from individual health to pursuing the perfection of the Aryan race, the moral limits of science blurred. Unimaginable horrors were justified at the expense of those deemed undesirable, all in an attempt to cure Third Reich soldiers. Under this perverse mentality, fueled by the promise of unlimited funding and resources, Nazi scientists undertook a series of torturous experiments, using human beings as guinea pigs in concentration camps, leaving thousands of fatal victims and wounded. Many people know the name of Dr. Mengele, but there were many more professionals involved in these atrocities. Let's meet some of the most infamous. Hans Ippinger. Hans Ippinger is a name that will remain in the history of medicine and the infamy of World War II. Born in Prague into a family of distinguished physicians, the destiny of this Nazi scientist was already marked by a legacy of knowledge and ambition. His academic journey led him to Strasbourg, where he forged his path to the most prominent places in medicine. In 1903, with a medical degree in hand, he began his career at a medical clinic in Graz before settling in Vienna in 1908. It was there, in the Austrian capital, where Eppinger immersed himself in the study of liver diseases, making a name for himself in the field of medicine with honor. He became a professor from 1918 onward in various renowned institutions, but behind these achievements, a shadow was cast that would tarnish his legacy. Eppinger was a prominent member of the NSDAP Nazi Party since September 1937 and embraced Nazi ideology fervently, turning his home into a refuge for Nazi student cells prior to Hitler's rise to power in search of party recognition. His notoriety grew during the development of World War II, not for his medical contributions that had been highlighting him until then, but for his atrocious experiments in the Dachau concentration camp. Alongside Professor Wilhelm Beigelbuch, he subjected Romani prisoners to a study of extreme cruelty. His sinister goal was to discover if humans could survive by drinking only seawater for a period of 6 to 12 days. 90 souls, deprived of food, were forced to endure this atrocious experiment. The result was heartbreaking. Most ended the study emaciated by the scars of dehydration and hunger, consequences of the scientific brutality imposed by Eppinger. The agony stemmed from the fact that human kidneys can only produce urine less salty than seawater. Therefore, to eliminate the excess salt ingested by drinking that liquid, more water needs to be urinated than was consumed. In the end, tragic death comes from dehydration, even when the senses indicate that thirst has been quenched. Throughout the trial, prisoners who suffered extreme dehydration reached the point of licking the wet floors they had been forced to mop in search of something to drink. This was the cruel physiological puzzle that revealed the extreme price the experimental subjects had to pay during the twisted Nazi scientists' experiment. Eppinger, a figure tormented by his own ambitions and loyalties, was engraved in history for the horrors perpetrated in the name of science, distorted by the ideology driven by the Führer. His legacy is a grim warning about the extremes to which perversion can go when intertwined with medical knowledge. However, he was not the worst exponent of Third Reich medicine. Klaus Schilling. In the ranks of Nazism, the name Klaus Schilling bears as many academic merits as unimaginable horrors. Born in the German city of Munich on July 5, 1871, this physician underwent a meteoric rise academically, earning his doctorate in 1895 and leaving an indelible mark in parasitology, with research that holds scientific value to this day. From German colonies in Africa to the lecture halls of the University of Berlin, Schilling also distinguished himself for his contributions to tropical medicine. His unwavering dedication led him to lead the division related to this area at the prestigious Robert Koch Institute in 1905, where he conducted research over 3 decades. However, his departure from the institute in 1936 would mark a sinister turn in the German doctor's career. Klaus Schilling moved to Mussolini's fascist Italy, where he found fertile ground for inhuman experiments with inmates from psychiatric asylums, whom Mussolini's regime considered expendable. These investigations were partly funded by the Nazi regime to assist Il Duce in his dark purpose, preparing for the Italo-Ethiopian War. His return to Germany in 1941 opened the door to a dark collaboration with Heinrich Himmler, the abominable leader of the SS. The Nazi hierarch gave Schilling a research station in the Dachau camp, where experimentation became a torture weapon for the inmates. First, an aberrant practice that tore through medical ethics was carried out, inflicting wounds on subjects, simulating the ravages of the battlefield suffered by Nazi soldiers, and seeking cures. Without mercy, these individuals were subjected to brutal experiments without anesthesia, with the aim of testing unapproved drugs designed to suppress infections and accelerate healing. But cruelty knew no bounds, as the tests were taken to the extreme. For example, bacteria were deliberately introduced into wounds, as well as ground glass and wood shavings to mimic lacerations suffered by Nazi troops. Prisoners who did not die from infections perished due to experimentation with the drugs. Later, Schilling turned to investigate his passion for tropical diseases, especially malaria. Prisoners were subjected to sadistic treatment, with hands and arms tied in cages filled with disease-carrying mosquitoes to investigate how it affected humans. Once the involuntary patients were infected, they were administered lethal doses of trial synthetic drugs in an attempt to find a cure that never materialized. The toll was devastating, with between 300 and 400 prisoners dying, while many thousands more were left permanently injured. Schilling would be convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity during the Nuremberg trials. In the Dachau trials, he faced the weight of his actions before a United States General Military Tribunal, whose investigation revealed a macabre picture of cruelties in which priests, women, and children were among the prisoners who had died in his experiments. The sentence for the doctor was the harshest, and he was executed by hanging on August 28, 1946, marking the end of a controversial figure condemned for his participation in scientific atrocities during the Third Reich. In this twisted drama, Klaus Schilling went from being a respected academic to a war criminal, and his legacy was tarnished by the atrocity of his experiments. Another of the names that stained the pages of German scientific history with shame is the sinister character we will expose next. Sigmund Rascher. In the heart of Munich on February 12, 1909, Sigmund Rascher was born, a man determined to become one of the darkest legends of the Third Reich. He grew up in a wealthy family, and his destiny seemed sealed from the beginning, since his father, Hans August, was already a physician for the feared SS at that time. When the shadow of Nazism began to loom over Germany, Rascher quickly embraced the ideology of the Third Reich fanatically. Affiliated with the Nazi Party since 1933, the young doctor had already joined the ranks of the SA, the infamous brown shirts of the Führer. His commitment to Adolf Hitler reached such a dogmatic extreme that, in an act of ruthless betrayal, he denounced his own father to the Gestapo for practices considered anti-Nazi. This masterful and sinister move would catapult his position within the SS, making him acquainted with various personalities of the Third Reich. It was in this ascent that his fate intertwined with that of Carolina Diehl, known as Nini, an enigmatic figure in the art scene with intimate connections to the SS leader. The marriage between Rascher and Diehl not only sealed their status in front of the Nazi government, but also led him to become an intimate friend of Heinrich Himmler. The darkest pages of his life were written in the concentration camps during World War II, particularly in Dachau. Already as a leading SS physician in 1939, he wrote to his superiors requesting human subjects for his experiments, believing that humans would be much better subjects for experiments than rodents. Himmler completely agreed. Despite having known each other for only a week before, there was a natural understanding in their disdain for some human lives they considered less important than others. Thus began a study in the fateful concentration camp. Like most of the Holocaust atrocities, Nazi medical experiments were situated at the perverse intersection of racism, industrialization, and science. When Himmler suggested that any prisoner who survived could be spared the death penalty and instead be sentenced to life imprisonment, Rascher disagreed. Convinced that they were scum, given that they were only Poles and Russians, there was no need to grant them that pardon. Initially tasked with investigating the effects of altitude on the human body, Rascher soon turned his experiments into an abyss of brutality and dehumanization. He proposed a series of cruel trials to measure human resilience in extreme conditions, from tests with Luftwaffe pilots to hypothermia experiments leading to death. In mid-1942, at the Dachau camp, Rascher conducted these atrocious tests under the supervision of SS officers, leaving indelible scars on the history of medicine and humanity. In the sinister corridors of his laboratory, Sigmund Rascher deployed a machinery of horror. The first macabre act took place in a decompression chamber, a dark apparatus designed to replicate the hellish conditions experienced by Luftwaffe pilots at 65,000 feet, equivalent to a chilling 20,000 meters above the Earth. Prisoners, hopeful of gaining freedom upon completion of the study, entered the test room unaware of the torment awaiting them. In the eerie setting, captives were equipped with protective masks and subjected to the physical conditions endured by a Nazi pilot. The true tragedy unfolded when Rascher denied oxygen to the inmates, and vital air vanished, emulating the circumstances of Luftwaffe members in steep dives. The alarm sounded, the mask was removed, and terror seized the bodies of the prisoners, convulsing in agonizing suffocation due to lack of oxygen. The notes in Rascher's reports are as illustrative as they are terrifying. I personally saw how a prisoner, deprived of the necessary amount of oxygen to survive, had his lungs burst. This is just a glimpse of the torment experienced in the laboratory, challenging the limits of human cruelty. In this macabre theater, some trials generated such pressure on the heads of these poor experimental subjects that desperation consumed them, and they ended up tearing out their hair in a desperate attempt to alleviate the cruel sensation suffocating them. However, the macabre symphony of experiments to measure human resilience carried out by this scientist knew no bounds. In the harsh August of 1942, Dr. Rascher, in his escalation of horrors, decided to delve into the unexplored territory of human freezing, due to the increasing cases of pilots who, after falling into the water, suffered from hypothermia. Thus, he ventured into a new trial, using a tank of icy water as a testing platform. This tank, with temperatures ranging from 2 to 12 degrees, became the deadly pool for around 300 Dachau prisoners. Rascher, as a sinister chronicler of misery, recorded every advancement. To date, I have cooled about 30 people, leaving them naked outdoors for 9 to 14 hours until reaching a body temperature of between 27 and 29 degrees. After a while, corresponding to a 1-hour journey, I have given these subjects a warm bath. So far, all patients have warmed up completely in an hour at most, although some of them still had white and frozen hands and feet. Since many prisoners did not respond to treatment, Rascher took the investigations to a place as irrational as it was sinister. As a test, he implemented a method he called animal warmth as a revival method. Demanding that female prisoners from the Ravensbrück camp be sent to Dachau, the doctor forced these women to become sex slaves whose function was clear: to provide warmth to prisoners on the brink of death from freezing. The methods were grotesque, varying according to the sadistic Dr. Rascher's instructions. These unbearable scenes ranged from placing the prisoner amidst 4 naked women to try to raise their body temperature, to more intimate practices like masturbation or rubbing. In some cases, they were even forced to engage in full sexual intercourse with semi-frozen prisoners. However, the study subjects invariably died, despite resuscitation attempts. Of the 300 prisoners used, nearly 100 died after this eerie investigation that only ended because its results provided no useful data to the Third Reich. And they began to cut funding to the sadistic scientist. Despite that, his medical experiments continued until just days before the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp in April 1945, when his spectacular career in the SS took an unexpected turn, due to the revelation of a family secret that would ruin everything built up until then. The doctor and his wife had 3 children when Caroline was already 48 years old, which sparked rumors about the method of conception. Rascher tried to overshadow the controversy by justifying the irregular situation, saying they were a very fertile family due to the purity of their race, but the truth would soon surface. While pretending to be pregnant with her 4th child, Diehl was arrested for attempted kidnapping, and it was soon discovered that the other 3 children were not biologically hers either. The 3 offspring of the Rascher family were not from the marriage, but were bought or stolen. The deception was a harsh blow to all the SS, and particularly to Himmler, his great friend, causing him to decide to impose exemplary punishment on both. The leader of the Nazi forces condemned the doctor to the punishment he probably feared the most, sending him to Buchenwald in 1944 as a common prisoner. Carolina, for her part, was sentenced to death and was hanged that same year. In 1945, Rascher was transferred back to Dachau and was executed on April 26 by a firing squad just days before the American liberation of the camp. His death occurred without any contemplation, in the same place where he had cruelly extinguished so many innocent lives. The story of Sigmund Rascher, Klaus Schilling, and Hans Eppinger is a dark journey through the corruption of science in totalitarian regimes. A grim reminder of the horrors perpetrated during the terror of the Nazi reign. The final chapter of this macabre era was written with the Nuremberg Code, born from the historic trial known as the Doctor's Trial. This set of 10 rules emerged to ensure that experimentation on humans was conducted ethically.
It was vicious and sadistic. A doctor is expected to have at least a little compassion. It goes against what the medical profession is all about. It was a group of doctors only thinking about their careers. They realized it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Maybe it wouldn't be possible in the future.
It's now or never.
The toll of these acts was over 15,000 lives sacrificed and 400,000 individuals traumatized, mutilated, or deformed. Although the Nazi scientific atrocities are in the past, the lesson in the Nuremberg Code persists: to remember so as not to repeat. In this way, we are reaching the end of today's tragic and mobilizing video. We thank you for staying until the end and look forward to seeing you in the upcoming installments of Military History.